current worldwide population is a little over 8 billion people spread across 195 countries. However, did you know that approximately half of those people live in just 6 countries? If we do the math, that means that only 3% of the world's total countries contain about 50% of the globe's inhabitants. Today on Across the Globe, we're going to be looking at why 50% of the world lives in these 6 overcrowded countries. Number 6. Nigeria. Nigeria is approximately 356,700 square miles, meaning that it's about the size of Nevada, Utah, and California combined. But while Nevada, Utah, and California have a total population of 45.5 million, Nigeria has 223.8 million residents, meaning that it has about 5 times the number of people as those states. What's more is that Nigeria's population has been growing, even recently seeing a yearly increase of 2.4%. For reference, the United States' population saw a 0.5% increase year over year. All in, what this means is that Nigeria holds 2.78% of the world's population and has a population density of 636 people per square mile. For some context, the least densely populated country in the world is Greenland, with a density of 0.14 people per square kilometer, which equates to about 0.05 people per square mile. The biggest reason that Nigeria is so populated is because of high birth rates. While the birth rate has slowed down somewhat in recent years, it still remains above average numbers globally. For instance, the global birth rate is 2.3 births per woman. But in Nigeria, that number is over double at 5.3 births per woman. One research paper states that some of the key reasons for Nigeria's ongoing high birth rate are norms encouraging large families, along with marriage and childbearing at a young age and lack of family planning. So what does the future hold for Nigeria? Well, Nigeria's birth rate is forecasted to be an issue, with the UN warning that Nigeria's rate of population increase is unsustainable. For instance, the UN estimated that at the country's current rate of expansion, it will be the 3rd most populated country in the world by 2050. Number 5. Pakistan. Pakistan is slightly smaller by its land size compared to Nigeria, totaling about 340,500 square miles. For reference, that's about the size of the United Kingdom and France put together. But despite its smaller size, Pakistan has about 17 million more people than Nigeria, with a total population of 240.5 million. If we look at that compared to the populations of the United Kingdom and France put together, it's about 1.8 times the population of those countries, 135 million people. All in, this means that Pakistan contains about 3% of the world's 8 billion people. For a country that's only 0.6% of the Earth's total landmass, that number is pretty significant. So let's look at some of the reasons for Pakistan's large population. Well, the first reason is that it's been increasing for quite some time now, with the population growing a massive 57% between 1998 and the present day. This high growth is caused by a birth rate that, while currently declining, is still well above the global average at a rate of 3.56 births per woman. While the reasons behind the high birth rate vary, experts say that things like a lack of family planning and religious reasons may be to blame. Another potential issue, or at least a factor explaining its large population, is that Pakistan has a high birth rate to death rate ratio. Specifically, the country's birth rate is 27.6 births per 1,000 people, yet the death rate is only 7.2 per 1,000 people. As you can imagine, the result of this is an ever-increasing population. What are the effects of Pakistan's large population? Well, for starters, Pakistan's high birth rate has led to crowded schools and medical clinics. But this isn't predicted to be a one-time issue. For instance, some experts say that Pakistan's population might double again by 2050, and the UN says that its population will reach a massive 400 million by 2050. This is predicted to put an even bigger strain on crucial infrastructure like water and sanitation systems, along with healthcare and education. Number 4. Indonesia. You might not think of Indonesia as having one of the biggest populations in the world, but with 277.5 million people, this puts it at number 4. I will note that Indonesia's landmass is significantly larger than the countries we've looked at so far, encompassing approximately 736,000 square miles. However, despite it having a lower population density, it still holds about 3.5% of the world's 8 billion people. I will note, though, that unlike Pakistan and Nigeria, Indonesia does have a recent slower rate of growth. The country's recent year-over-year change in its population was 0.74%, which equates to about 2 million people. Interestingly, Indonesia's current birth rate is lower than the global average birth rate at a rate of about 2 births per woman. However, the reason its population is so large may be due to the fact that birth rates have not always been this low. For instance, it wasn't until 2017 that Indonesia's birth rate started to drop below today's current average birth rate, meaning that a higher-than-average birth rate over a long period of time likely contributed to this country's large population. While you might think that Indonesia's larger landmass means that overpopulation isn't as much of an issue here, unfortunately, that's not the case. In fact, many parts of Indonesia's infrastructure are suffering as a result of its large population. Public transportation, for instance, is overcrowded, and the country is struggling with housing, water, and food shortages. That last one is a key issue, with one report revealing that Indonesia doesn't have enough rice fields to sustain its own population, and so it has to import rice from abroad. Number 3. United States. As many of you likely guessed, the United States is the third most populated country in the world, with about 340 million people. Year over year, the U.S.'s population increased about 0.5%, which is a little over 2 million people. All in, the U.S. holds about 4.23% of the world's population. However, unlike the countries we've looked at so far, the U.S. has a significantly larger total area, as it's made up of about 3.8 million square miles, including 3.5 million square miles of land and 277,000 square miles of water. That makes it one of the 5 biggest nations in the world by its physical size. The U.S.'s large landmass also means that it is significantly less dense than the other countries we've looked at so far, although that doesn't mean that it's considered a low-density country. For instance, the U.S. has a population density of 96 people per square mile, compared to 397 people per square mile for Indonesia, 808 for Pakistan, and 636 for Nigeria. In other words, despite having a population that's significantly larger than some of these other countries, the U.S. may not feel as overpopulated because of its large landmass. Okay, population density aside, let's look at why the U.S. has such a big population. There are 2 major reasons for this, and those are immigration and birth rates. In terms of immigration, the U.S. has long been known as a place that's receptive to immigrants. For instance, the number of first-generation immigrants in the U.S. increased from 9.6 million in 1970 to 38 million in 2007. The U.S. has also had historically high birth rates, with, for example, an average of 7 children born to every woman in the year 1800. However, with the exception of a brief uptick in the 1940s and 50s, this birth rate has been on the decline since 1800, with the current birth rate being only 1.64 births per woman. Quite the change from Nigeria. Still, the U.S. is expected to increase from its current 340 million people to 388 million by 2050, which is still a major increase. Number 2. China. Next up on our list is China, which has a total population of 1.425 billion people, over 4 times the people in the U.S., despite being about the same size. China's population is so large that about 17% of the world's 8 billion people live in China. Unlike the other countries we've looked at so far, though, China has actually seen a decline in its population year over year at a negative 0.02% change. That's not that big compared to its massive size, but it has led to a decrease in its population of about 216,000 over the course of the past year. So, What's behind China's enormous population and why has it declined recently? Well, let's start with the first part. What got China to this point? There's a lot throughout history that has led to this point, and while we're not going to go too in-depth here, I'll hit the main points from more recent historical events. Starting after World War II, China's population started to increase significantly when the country's government encouraged higher birth rates out of an attempt to increase the country's wealth, build a stronger army, and start producing more food. This peaked in 1970 when the average woman was giving birth to 6.3 children. However, as you may already know, China began its one-child policy in 1980 until it ended in 2016 to address the country's overwhelmingly high growth rate. This policy ultimately led to a birth rate that, at its lowest, was 1.61 children for every woman in 2005. Now, even though the policy has ended, its effects have become so ingrained into society that birth rates have not really picked back up by much. In addition, birth rates have not surpassed death rates, which has led to China's recent declining population. Experts also attribute factors like increasing costs of raising a child and slow economic growth to the country's currently low birth rate. Number 1. India. And the country with the largest population in the world is India. India has a population that's only slightly higher than China's, with about 1.428 billion residents. Altogether, those who live in India make up almost 18% of the world's population, or nearly 1 in 5 people. Unlike China's population, India's population has been increasing with a positive 0.81% recent year-over-year change, equating to an increase of about 11.5 million people. Looking at the country's size, India is about 1.27 million square miles, making it about a third the size of the US but having 4.2 times the population. Here's one stat that will help explain why India's population has grown so large. About half of the country's population is made up of those who are younger than 25. As a result, while India's birth rate is declining, it's anticipated that even this falling birth rate won't be enough to immediately slow down population growth because of how many young people there are. For instance, Time reports that India isn't even expected to reach its peak population until 2065. Another stat is that India has historically seen a high birth rate, which also partially explains its large population. Between 1880 and 1975, for instance, India saw a regular birth rate of between 5.41 and 5.95 births per woman. That number has steadily declined since 1975, but was still as high as 2.24 in 2020. What about the countries going downhill in 2024?